I'd like to introduce this afternoon's lecturer. It's Dr. Harlow Landphair. Many of you here know him as the visiting faculty fellow for our 2011-2012 year. Dr. Landphair has been teaching design studio and advanced construction and construction, as he calls it. He's been also working on the 4th edition of his seminal work in landscape architecture construction, which is used as textbooks across the country. And also offering specialized courses in water and lighting design. Dr. Landphair is very much engaged and has been for a long time in research in landscape architecture, expanding the importance of technology, knowledge base for practice. His efforts have included development of a nationally recognized laboratory facility and testing protocols for erosion prevention and sedimentation control. He earned his bachelor's from the University of Florida, his master's in agronomy from Mississippi State, and his doctorate in environmental design from Texas A&M in 1977. I've had the pleasure of doing research and teaching with Dr. Landphair, and so it's a great pleasure to introduce him to you today and his talk on landscape architecture and research. So if you would please welcome Dr. Landphair.
Okay, thanks, folks. I'm going to kind of read this, and I hope it doesn't offend you that I do that. But if I get started, I'm going to wander around if I don't stick to this. So let me get through this, and then if you want, we'll discuss some of the ideas that I may throw out. It might upset some of you. If it does, that's too bad. And I call this thing a journey in research practice in landscape architecture. And in thinking about what to share with you, I began noticing some issues related to what appears to be an increasing focus on research here and research and publication. I also recognize similar reactions to this attitude that are very reminiscent of where we were at Texas A&M in the 1980s. Now, that's been a while ago. Now, based on what I've seen and experienced around the country, I believe that the focus on research and publication will become a major consideration for tenure, promotion, and financial rewards. And I've decided to share a sort of reflection on my own experience with going through this in a maturing research institution, and how I've come to believe that research relates to the design professions. My actual presentation is not very long, but I would like to complete my remarks because they're intended to make means to begin dialogue about how design programs like landscape architecture at Ball State University needs to move forward and hopefully use the change as an opportunity to strengthen their program and benefit the faculty at large. Now, perhaps just by way of introduction, I should sort of give you a quick rundown of where I came from, how I came to where I am today. Actually, I'm retired. I don't work anymore. But how I came to my conclusion about, where research is and why is it important to our design professions. First of all, I came into teaching more or less by accident. After getting out of school and practicing for about 7 years in both the public and private sector, I did a little design build, and then I did a little bit of municipal work. But then I got real interested in land development. At Florida, if you think back to Florida in the 60s, we had a huge boom. Disney came in, and then everything exploded. It was an unbelievable thing. Land development exploded, and I got real interested in that market and the design and some of the things that were happening at the time. So I decided I was going to go back and get an MBA. So seeing as how I had to eat, and I had a family, I had 2 very young children and a wife, I had to take a job at Mississippi State University as an instructor to feed my face while I was working on a graduate degree. So I was working on an MBA, And I got to teaching and found out I really liked it. It was fun. And I enjoyed the students. Well, anyway, I enjoyed the students a lot, and I decided then halfway through that I was going to change majors. So I was working with a group of people in horticulture and agronomy there, because at Mississippi State at that time, agriculture, landscape architecture was in agriculture. So I was office right next to a sweet potato expert. And I learned more about sweet potatoes and peanuts than I ever wanted to know. But he was a great guy, and we had a lot of fun together. But anyway, I found out that I kind of enjoyed this mode of practice, and so I changed, and what I ended up getting was a Master of Extension Education, of all things, with a major in adult education and agronomy. Then I sat there and was looking at my credentials, and I'm going, I don't have a terminal degree in design. And if I'm going to stay in this profession, I think people read credentials, so I better go looking for another program. So I decided, I looked around the country. I looked at Berkeley, I looked at Harvard and MIT, and back then they had a beginning PhD program and so forth. And I finally hit on Texas A&M, and for financial reasons as much as anything else, I ended up at Texas A&M simply because I could afford it. And it turned out to be a great experience. Of course, I got to Texas A&M to get a doctor's degree and never made enough money to leave, but that's neither here nor there. So I also learned in my experience that the advancement in higher education often rested on credentials. So if you didn't have the credential, you didn't get a look. When I received my doctor's degree at Texas A&M in environmental design, I then practiced and taught and wrote for about 5 years. And I had been teaching construction technology, and at that time there was just no book to teach out of, and it was a difficult time to give the students the material, so I decided I was going to write a book and did. Then after I kind of completed that, Don Austin and I, who had just retired as the department head, he and I decided to open a practice, so we did. And we had 4 really good years. We did some really fun projects around the state, and then the oil crash or the oil boom busted it. And in 81 and 82, everything came tumbling down. And I found myself, in order to keep working, I had to travel between Arizona and Boston and Florida, and it just got to be too much of a drag to try to do that and teach too, so I said I quit. And then what happened to us in the department, the university was changing at the time, and they kept saying, y'all going to have to do research and publication. Hell, I couldn't even spell publication at that time, much less research. So, here we go. But we had a dean, and we had department heads in architecture at that time. Gary will appreciate this. It was David Woodcock at the time. Kept telling upper administration, we're different. We don't do all that research and publication stuff. We teach. We're designers. Well, this went on for about 5 years, and they seemed to accept it. About 1987 or so, upper administration came down and says, folks, that's not going to fly anymore. You either get with the program or get out. It came down to a point where they were about to dissolve the College of Architecture and Environmental Design. What they were going to do was take landscape architecture, and they were going to put it in horticulture, in agriculture. They were going to take construction science and architecture and put them back in engineering from whence they first came. So we almost got to dissolve, but instead what they did is they brought in a wildly ambitious man as dean. He literally dismantled the college. I'm not going to go into matrix organization and stuff like this, but the man took the college apart. Budgets were pulled from the departments, centralized under the dean's office. Program decisions were also the province of the dean. The dean began bringing in people with strong research and publication records. They were hired as full professors at salaries that dwarfed those of some of the senior faculty in the college. At first, we thought these new hires would begin to mentor young faculty and help generate research funding that will help us develop a strong research program. We quickly learned that this was not the case. These people were only interested in the narrow pursuits and not the college or the faculty. Then in 1987, our department got a university grant. It was a small grant, and I got tapped by the department head to say, "Go get them, son. We're going to develop research." Well, I took it on. At the time, I was beginning to think maybe I was dumb to do so. But this is where I began my journey in research, and I did two things, and fortunately they happened to work. First thing I did was look at our infrastructure base and develop our departmental computer base. And this proved to be very beneficial in the ability to get work at the time. Now keep in mind, this PC was just maturing. I can remember my excitement the first time I got my 5 megabyte hard card in my Tandy 1000 computer. Whoopee! No more 5 1/4 inch floppy disks and so forth. So it was crude at the time, but it worked. And it did help us. Then I started looking around and asking myself, okay, if we're going to do research, what is it we're going to do research on? And I started looking not at the federal government to fund us, but what was the federal government doing that was going to impact the state of Texas? And what I discovered is there were some really big changes coming down, 87 amendments to the Clean Water Act implementing what is now known as the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, the NPDES. And what I discovered in building up my own knowledge, I had actually been very interested in reclamation of drastically disturbed land, and that was part of where I did my work in my Doctor of Environmental Design program. But to make a long story short there, what happened was I discovered that the program that had been doing most of the seminal research in the area of sediment erosion control was at Utah State. His name was Israelson. Had retired, well actually he died, but he had retired some years early, and the program had stagnated. The people that were in it weren't doing anything with it anymore, so it had essentially stopped there. But if you looked at all the research in terms of the way they were developing the NPDES regulations, it was all based on Israelson's work. So I became very familiar with that and became an expert in that, and then began looking at how we could develop a sediment and erosion control laboratory to actually advance the research in that area. And as it worked, I proposed it to TxDOT, and by 1989, TxDOT came through with the first $250,000 to actually begin construction of the lab. And that had us off and running. And that lab is still there, and they just went through $1.5 million expansion this last year. So anyway, we developed the program, and then over the course of practice, I've come to believe that research should be a part of academic practice, and that's the focus of the remainder of my presentation. Now, I ask you please to keep in mind that while I'm going through this and talking about needs for research, I came at this from the we are different, we are teachers, we are not researchers attitude as well. I was not real happy about this to begin with. So, research is really not a traditional form of practice in landscape architecture. However, after spending the greatest portion of my professional career in academic practice and research, I'm convinced that one key to the advancement and expansion of the professions, and maybe even the survival of the professions, may depend on how the profession embraces and supports research. So what? To answer this question, I'd like to explore two important environmental influences. First, we need to consider the point of contemporary environment and the mindset of the state-supported institution. Built environment programs, and in particular landscape architecture programs, continue to cling to the notion that the built environment disciplines are somehow different than scientists, social scientists, engineers, and other academics. This notion seems to be that we're appliers and synthesizers of knowledge. Others seem to expect administration to believe that as designers we're endowed with magical creative powers, that we ingest knowledge We then wave our magic 314 pencils over the tracing paper and poof, great solutions emerge. I'm here to tell you that I don't think anything could be farther from the truth, and that this somehow makes us different is just not flying. Oh, really? It's just simply not going to fly anymore, and we've got to stop thinking that way. During the late 70s and early 80s, this attitude seemed to be accepted at the upper levels. I'm back at A&M now, of administration. However, in the mid-80s, we were told flat out this argument wasn't going to fly anymore. Get with it and get over it. Programs were and are increasingly pressured to get with the program. In other words, research and publish or perish. Increasingly, budgets for departments, consideration for promotion and tenure, and hiring of new faculty have been based on research, publication, and perceived ability to research and publish. Sound familiar? Hiring, many institutions was built on environmental programs now require a PhD to even be considered for a tenured track position. Look at the job announcements for faculty, and most all of them will say PhD preferred. Now, I happen to be one that believes a PhD is good for one thing. Take it and $1.25 and you can go to the Speedway and buy coffee. But it depends upon what you do with it, and it is a credential. One last statistic, the last 6 hires in landscape architecture at Texas A&M University have been PhDs or PhDs in waiting. Miss Jody was the last master's candidate we ever hired, and we almost couldn't hire her. The second thing that I want to point out as an environmental influence is the ownership of knowledge. Oh, that's silly. No one can own knowledge. Oh, really? In courts of law, professional registration statutes, and even the general public, professionals are prevented from practicing in some areas because they are presumed to have no expertise. For example, in Indiana, as a registered landscape architect, I would not be permitted to prepare stormwater management plans, stormwater pollution prevention plans for projects, even though I have a significant expertise and have produced a significant body of research knowledge in this particular area. So, while I can clearly demonstrate an expertise in the area, I would be prevented from applying it, the expertise in practice, because landscape architects are not, by statute, competent. It's also the result of ongoing turf battle between the various professions. It's here, it's everywhere. While I believe that the Indiana statute could be challenged on several levels in a court of law, it may come down to the perceived ownership of knowledge. Yet how can someone or profession own knowledge? I don't think there would be much disagreement among the general audience that the sciences, whether it's physical, natural, biological, or other social sciences, are intimately involved in research at all levels. However, the pure sciences are very different in that they are principally interested in knowledge, not necessarily the application of that knowledge. Whereas we, the engineering profession and so forth, are very much interested in building something. Now, one of the most interesting and best examples of how this constant ownership of knowledge battle goes on is medicine. The pure scientists in medicine often look down on the practicing physicians as just merely clinicians. Well, while the general public, on the other hand, sees the medical doctor and the practicing professionals and the scientists as all part of one big profession that is engaged in medical practice. Engineering is perceived in much the same way as a profession. As a profession, they rely on and utilize their research arm as a means of selling and protecting their professional domain. ASHRAE, ACE, and other engineering societies have active research agendas and actively publish research in all areas of engineering practice. In other words, the engineering profession, like medicine, law, and even business, work hard at creating the perceived ownership of knowledge. I'm not keeping up. Now, okay, so how are we, the built environment professionals, perceived? When it comes to the professions concerned with the built environment, no such link or perception of strong research links exists yet. We are not usually perceived by our academic colleagues as researchers or generators of knowledge. I remember one particular research meeting that we went to, John Motlock and I attended, with our science, agriculture, engineering, and geosciences colleagues at Texas A&M. It was about 1980, as I recall, and what we were doing is we were balled together. We were supposed to do the environmental analysis for the superconducting super collider, which they were going to try to build in Texas at the time. Well, it all kind of fell apart due to geology and money, and actually Congress didn't appropriate the money, so they took it to France and built it in France and Austria, or Sweden, or Switzerland. I'll get it right in a second. And a lot of people were, you know, that's the thing out there. It's a big circle that goes around underground, and they think it's going to blow the whole world up. It hadn't done it yet, so so far so good. But as we went around the room and introduced ourselves, both of us introduced ourselves as landscape architects for the College of Architecture and Environmental Design. And I happened to be sitting next to a geophysicist, actually who I knew and had taken a course from at one time. Chris leans over to me and he says, "What the hell are you doing here?" He says, "You're not a scientist." Well, needless to say, I was a little taken back, you know, and, you know, what do you say? So I sort of took my hurt feelings and took them home, but I resolved that I was going to do something about it, and this wasn't going to happen anymore. Now, I could go on to several setbacks that we had over the next few years, but we kept at it, which was the main thing. And I think slowly, all of our programs around the country are changing. I believe our professions are seeing that the demands of the universities have placed on the built environment faculties are A, ain't going away. And secondly, I think we're starting to find out that they can be met and that we can deal with it in the academic environment, that we don't have to keep saying we're different. But one profession is way behind, in my opinion, and that's landscape architecture. Landscape architecture, as represented by the American Society of Landscape Architects, has yet to recognize the need and the value of having a strong published research agenda. Apparently, there's a perception, and I have visited with the presidents of ASLA over the last 3 presidential terms. I have talked to the trustees. I have gone and said, look, guys, it doesn't cost any money. Just put together a group we could use. We used to have what they called the professional interest groups. I forget what they call them now. But they didn't like the term pigs. So whatever they are called now, I mean, it would be fairly easy to use that organization to develop a research agenda. But they have this perception somehow that you've got to be able to fund the research. Well, that's nothing could be farther from the truth. The National Academy of Sciences, for example, through its various committees, such as the Building Research Board, the Transportation Research Board, the National Institutes of Health, publish huge lists of research needs. They don't have any money. They do research, but all the funding for those institutes come from other places. A lot of it's governmental. But the point is, it's other things fund them. But they get it by publishing research agendas. Now, what's the significance of a published research agenda? Publication of an agenda does 2 very important things. First, it informs the general public and research community what the professional interests are and what their needs are. It provides guidance for individuals in academic practice regarding real needs and can be used to support material when seeking funding for individual projects aimed at addressing the defined issues. Second, it begins to demonstrate in the generation and use of knowledge. It puts a stake in it. It says we are interested in this is knowledge we generate and that we use. Okay? And we apply, and it also says that other built environment professionals, that we generate, use, and apply the knowledge in an exercise of our own professions. It begins to establish ownership of that knowledge and areas of expertise. It tells Congress and other funding sources that there's a need for research in these areas, and that practicing landscape architects have the skills to generate and apply that knowledge. It helps explain to our academic colleagues what the areas of concern are, and that we too can apply scientific process and procedures in the generation of new knowledge. Lastly, it helps provide credibility to our practitioners for them, and it clarifies overlap with other professions. Now, how do traditional design programs have to change? First, realize that the "we are different" thing is not going to fly. I know I've said that 100,000 times, it seems like, before, but it ain't going to fly. So in the academic environment, how do we go about changing our traditional design programs to embrace academic research and practice, and strengthen our ownership of knowledge, and preserve our traditional professional values of creating safe, sustainable environments that enrich the quality of life? First, I think it's important to develop strong PhD programs in the built environment colleges. This is happening slowly, and there are more and more design professionals with the PhD credential. However, at this time, not all these new PhDs hold the same professional values of traditional practice. The reason for this can be attributed to our graduate program models, particularly the career change model. So how do we both really change? Nationally, I believe there have been two models that I would like to explore with you for accomplishing the goal of expanding graduate programs and increasing the research output of the programs. The first is the engage experts for research disciplines model. The first is to engage experts from other disciplines, bring their reputations, publication records, and research agendas to the program, and on paper it immediately makes the department and the college look good. Lots of peer-reviewed papers along with good production of research dollars. However, these specialists cannot teach basic design. They're not necessarily interested in being good critics, nor do they have a grasp of the understanding and knowledge and skills required of the practicing landscape architect, or planner. When this model is instituted in a traditional design program, it looks good to the bean counters upstairs, and to the statistics people that want to count research publications and research dollars. However, in my opinion, it ends up having disastrous effects on our programs. First and most importantly, it places the professional faculty at a decided disadvantage. These faculty are being asked to develop research and publication agendas for their own advancement, including salaries and promotion. On the other hand, they have to carry the studio load and the fundamental course load for the program. What gets ignored here is that the faculty are prevented from developing upper-level content that will draw graduate students to them, who will help them further and advance their own research agendas. All of this is being usurped by the non-professional faculty. Then other things start to happen. We see experiments of trying to teach design by lecture. We see the European model being instituted, where faculty disappear continuously and students have very little access because the faculty are gone. Now, the other model, you can tell I probably don't like that model. The other model is the working to develop the expertise in-house model within the profession. Now, one of the problems with this model, the reason we don't see it more often, is it takes time. It's painful. And people want instant gratification, which the previous model gives you. Now, this is not widely practiced because the current model of scorekeeping, which is focused on research dollars generated and peer-reviewed publications done have to do with how you evaluate your faculty. It's also difficult because the recruitment of graduate students is frequently tied to the ability of programs to obtain research funding and provide support. However, I sincerely believe of the professional programs, it depends on the deployment of the grow your own mode, which must begin with the profession at large recognizing the value of a strong academic research base. With this done, we must begin developing departments with strong research programs. By this, I mean developing consensus among the faculty about the program's research interests. Too often, the faculty of a large program become disparate in terms of their interest, and it's like trying to herd cats to get a handle on where research expertise is focused. I'm also aware that faculty don't like being pigeonholed. The key, therefore, is to identify our programs in an area broad enough to embrace numerous areas of exploration. This identification with an area of research helps give the program identity and begins to fit the pieces into a framework for funding. Project development depends on being able to move the focus to where the current funding is. In my case, the broad focus was in transportation. This is a big topic that embraces many sorts of projects. Over the years, we did work in computer visualization, developed aesthetic design manuals, developed GIS-based roadside maintenance systems. We developed native grass establishment techniques and worked on the ecology, successional ecology of the roadside. We developed and ran the largest erosion and sediment control laboratory facility in the country. Lots of different projects, but it all tied under the big umbrella of transportation. In doing this kind of work, we were able to support a full-time staff of 9, and that included 5 full-time registered landscape architects doing nothing but research. We had a full-time, and I also had, usually on the staff, we were able to support 5 graduate students, master's type students, and 3 PhD students each year. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes you didn't have a student or whatever. Sadly, what I don't think we were able to do through this program, and which bothered me, was to bring many of our career change graduate students, master's students, to a level of interest in design that seemed to be the same level of design that seems to be engendered in the undergraduate level programs. Now, how do we go about implementing? Here I'm talking about you need to do this, you need to. How do you go about doing this? To deploy this model, it becomes almost chicken and egg situation, you know. How do we get a PhD program without research? How do we get a research without a research record in PhD students? You know, what comes first? I'm sorry. I keep harking on the PhD program, but it is an important unit of it. I think the first step is developing a strong PhD programs in the built environment colleges. This is happening slowly, and there are more and more design professionals with PhD credentials. However, at this time, not all of these PhDs hold the same professional values and traditional practice. The reason for this can be attributed to the graduate program models, which I've already mentioned. We don't really demand a practice segment in these programs. That needs to be reevaluated. These programs can provide the foundation for competent researchers in the field, but they need to have a fundamental ability to practice design and see it as a framework for their research projects. Hopefully, well, that's something to discuss. Next, you need to identify your program with a broad area of specialization. Identify your area of expertise, and from what I've seen here at Ball State, sustainable environments tends to fit what you all do. Yes, it's a big popular buzzword, but however, there are numerous areas of funding with potential. Walkable communities, transit-friendly communities, low-impact development, green development technologies, LEED, material science, system analysis, etc. All of these tend to fit under that category. Efforts fit under this broad model, and it gives notice to the program that the program has both interest and expertise. Develop a plan. Now, what does that plan involve? you're just completing an accreditation cycle. This means that the SER is still fresh in everyone's mind, or should be if you haven't read it. And there should be a sense of where the improvements can be made. Use this as a jumping off point. But first, you have to accept the fact that research and publication is going to be a requirement. It's not going away, and to succeed, you need to be ahead of the wave, or the wave is going to roll over you. Identify your personnel needs. Identify the types of personnel you need and put research in with teaching. I believe that you need to think in terms of split appointments. Split appointments. Faculty that are only 50% academic and must generate an additional 50% of their salary from research. You have contract positions that are well suited to this strategy. Stop and think. 4 faculty on 50% appointments essentially add 2 FTEs. Another important part of the personnel issue is the academic loading. It is vital that the contract hours of the faculty be set to allow time for pursuit of project development, personal improvement, and publication. This takes time. A 9-month load should not exceed 1 lecture and 1 studio per semester, about 7 credit hours. You need to give credit for the advising of graduate students. And 1 course should be allocated to advanced pursuits. The faculty should be working in an area of their own research. Credit must also be given for advising upper-level graduate students. If you've never advised a PhD student, you will be amazed at the time that it takes in those pursuits. This is pretty much a general standard in terms of loading in most of the major research institutions. Next, identify their physical resource needs. Now, if you're going to be a research school, you're going to have some needs in terms of what equipment and stuff you have. So you need to identify what those resources are. Key things that help the situation: land. If you're going to do any kind of laboratory work, you need to go get yourself some land. Okay? Equipment. Things like automated samplers, counters, data loggers, GPS equipment, high-speed cameras, and the like. Those are all things that you use in research. These kinds of resources can be extremely important in your ability to actually get funding for a project. Another big one. Here's the people with the money. Identify the client base. Who are you going to market to? Start with local state programs before looking at federal agencies. Environmental agencies, parks and recreation, forestry and transportation, the like, at the local level, at the state level. The federal, many of the big federal agencies have their own research programs and compete for federal dollars. Likewise, earmarks have hurt a broad research funding picture over the last few years. Congress has had these earmarks that are just killing us in the research area. And that's why I recommend you stay away from the feds. It's kind of a fraternity. You need to build your record, get your contacts, get your network, and then you can go after federal dollars. But all federal dollars are not equal. One of the things that I caution you about is a lot of the federal programs, particularly NSF, which everybody just goes gaga over. Oh, he got NSF funding. Well, wonderful. But if you look at what it takes to get an NSF project, you've got to fund half of it, which means the university has to give them your salary and you don't get any return on indirect. You can't run a business that way. So don't get all hot and bothered over some of this stuff. Do the old mundane stuff and get paid for it right. Anyway, I'll get off my course. Who all the client base is. States often get federal pass-through funds that need to be identified. You need to look at these programs, and we found that many states don't bother to apply for these funds because they either don't have the personnel or they simply haven't perceived the research need. It's going to be up to you to help them understand that they need to be doing research. And then finally, think regionally. In your area, I would think you ought to be looking at Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. All within much. Texas is too damn big to get out of. Anyway, next thing is to know your competition. Be cognizant of the competition. Pay attention to what they're doing. As it were, know your enemy. Purdue has the Hatch Act money. You ain't going to get none of that money. That goes to them as a land-grant institution. That's where they get their base to do all the piddly little research projects that they do in agriculture. They also have one big major federal laboratory, U.S. Erosion Control Laboratory, which is a lot of my big competition. Indiana University probably has the public health market covered pretty well in terms of trying to get money. Don't waste time looking for that type of work. Look for the gaps where your interests are and see if the themes fit. For example, how does health and communities, for example, I'm trying to say, how does health affect design in communities? Well, Indiana University probably has the money in that area. They just don't know there needs to be research done on it. You need to develop a collegial relationship with the people there doing those kinds of things. You'd be surprised how receptive they can be to design professionals working with them. Look for opportunities to do work with sister state institutions. This takes some careful exploration to find compatible colleagues. They're not necessarily in design disciplines. Look in areas like geography, geology, engineering, and biology, etc. These make excellent research colleagues. And legislators in particular like to see joint projects among state institutions. They get to spread the wealth, and go back to their and say, look who I supported. Okay? So they really like to see that kind of collegiality building. So, excuse me, I'm sorry, take advantage of that. Getting a little dry. Identify the need and finances. Oh, we need money. That's right, you do need money. Be realistic, though. Make a well-thought-out plan for the amortization of the costs. Don't be running upstairs and tell them we need money, less than you can tell them how you're going to recover it. Because without that strategy in today's environment, extra funding, or your chances of getting extra funding out of administration are nil. When you get this done, make the ask. I'm looking at Karen when I say this, Jody. Go to administration and settle the plan. Lay the groundwork. One big factor to think about when making the ask is the language you use. Be sure your vocabulary is couched in terms that match the administrator's experience and their bosses, the legislator. What's the legislature been telling the administration in budget battles? What's the mood of the state? What does administration have to do to look good? Your job is to make them look good. It's also important to think about who the administrator is. I can remember getting an education in this myself. You don't approach a historian with the same language and vocabulary that you would approach a mathematician or, heaven forbid, a statistician. Use academic language to the extent possible, not design vocabulary. I sound like I'm preaching. Then you need to deliver. Once you get all this done, if you can get the support, don't be sitting back and say, whoa, we did it. Now the work's just started. It's difficult to say much more about the specifics here at Ball State because I really don't know the faculty that well and a lot of the administrative ins and outs. But one very important point that you need to be very careful about in the future, in the immediate future, and I've heard this sort of bandied about the halls. I've heard it called a bunch of different things. But talk about bringing in a, quote, high power, high visibility individual, unquote. I've heard this. Be forewarned. As I noted in my introductory remarks, these people usually have their own agenda and are primarily interested in continuing with their own network, not yours. And whatever the case, be sure that anyone brought in is capable of working in the trenches. If they don't have the built environment design background, they'll not be able to pull a full load in the studio, and that penalizes the existing faculty. Oh, dear. back to the PhD program. There are young, bright individuals that are looking for an academic career, and they have the PhD, and they know research methods. They have an academic design background and carry a studio caseload. What they will lack is experience. It's absolutely vital that we encourage these young folks to get work in the field as part of the tenure track. As part of a tenure track, there are at least 5 summers periods that can be devoted to some type of actual practice. Likewise, they need to be minimally competent. That is, they should be registered in one of the professions. We also need to do a better job of recruiting people into academic practice from the field. We need to get them into our graduate programs, preferably PhD programs, so that they can learn to compete in this area of professional endeavor. If there's going to be a strong cadre of graduate students, there needs to be a PhD program. These students are vital to furthering the research output of the program. They aren't just worker bees to be used to work. They should be partners in building the program and making it grow. Clearly, Ball State is close enough to Indianapolis already and already has a growing urban presence. This is a super fertile ground for attracting individuals with interest in academic practice to PhD programs in urban and regional science, for example. In developing the program, be sure the knowledge base design is at the core of the degree focus, not social science, statistics, or other non-design based disciplines. Did everybody get that? At last. Some closing thoughts. Research has many faces, and if a university is going to demand research and publication, they must also recognize the limitation of teaching loads. They must provide the environment, and then they have the right to measure expectations. Faculties must then work as a team to generate funded opportunities for themselves and their students. It's a different form of practice that needs to be better articulated to practicing professionals and supported by them. In doing so, we must be careful that we do not lose ourselves in reductive pursuits and lose sight of our profession's broad mission. Finally, we need to stop talking to ourselves. We need to be talking to the other professions about what we do. We must stop letting others define what we do and take possession of the knowledge we use and generate. So here's a challenge. Go out and give a paper to the NAHB or the ASCE or the NAP. Okay? Anyone but your own profession, particularly the comfort sphere of CELA. We need CELA, but we cannot use it as a pacifier and a safe haven. I encourage you to start working on your departmental plans to grow your research programs and get them to administration before administration starts making plans for you. Start examining your time commitments and set aside time for project promotion and development. Identify the market and find the clientele. Scientific process and research methods are not the property of the sciences and engineering and other disciplines. They are simply tools for the creation of knowledge. And they apply to elements of the built environment, which is our domain. I want to thank you all for coming out. With that, I'll take questions, or you can get on me if you want to. But that's how I see it, and I said it, and I'll stick to it.
If you all would like to ask questions, they've asked us if we could either use the mic or just talk really loud. When you face this way, it has to do a bounce back to get into their recording, so I can bring the mic around or just talk loud.
Joe?
Sure. In the developing of a PhD program, knowing who we are currently, we have two people, perhaps one person that has a PhD. How does a program that doesn't have PhDs create a PhD
Don't sit around crying your beer about it. Go to it. You know what a PhD is. And as you begin to work through this, your next hires will probably be PhDs. There's getting to be more and more out of them out there. And from what I've seen on those resumes, there's some really good kids out there. So, don't hold yourself back by saying, we ain't got no PhD, so we can't do that. That's just another excuse. You can do it. A&M actually did it. I mean, they started offering a DED. They didn't have any doctoral people. I think I was the third or fourth person with a doctoral on the teaching faculty at A&M in the College of Architecture. So it was me and Don Sweeney, and I can't remember now. I've slept too many times betwixt then and now. But that's just going to hold you back.
There's some practicality to that, right? Is there, if you're saying that to achieve that through either training or new hires, then there is an assumption that that's going to take some amount of time.
I'm going to guess that you've got faculty here that understand the scientific method, the research process, and so forth. Just because you don't have a PhD don't mean you can't make one, okay? There are plenty of PhDs on this campus that can help you and support you, help you with your statistics, so forth and so on. There's lots of colleagues. You can go out and discover them. It's just no reason to hold back on it. Because your research stability in this college is going to depend on developing a good PhD program. You can't do it with a master's program. Yes, Sonny.
Obviously, time is of the essence, but about how long did it take Texas to do this?
Well, as far as the development of a research program, it took me about 4 years to really get it to where it was on a paying proposition. We didn't have any money. I mean, we got a few little projects as we started, but we didn't get our first. We got our first big grant. Well, no, 3 years. I got my first $250,000 in the third year. And one of the things I realized is it's just as easy to go after bigger money than it is to go after little money. And you have just as much trouble completing a $3,000 project as you do with a $250,000 project. The only difference is you get to hire more people with a bigger project. Does that answer, Martha?
Well, I'm sure every program is different, and you can't.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have some fits and starts, but I mean, you know what you're going into. It's a lot like running a business. I mean, we're not a whole lot different than a private practice in a way when you go into the research arena, because you got to go get jobs. If you don't get jobs, you don't eat. I mean, it's that simple. You have to keep track of your time. You have to pay attention to how much money you're spending. Otherwise, you go broke. You don't get it done. I mean, it's just a different form of practice. Carla?
At Texas, what was the state governing body or the university governing body's role in developing a PhD program?
State governing body. Well, our governing body was the Texas A&M University system, which at that particular time consisted of the Texas Forest Service, Texas Transportation Institute, the name of the, it was an institution up in north central Texas that was, why can't I just slip by me? But there was 2 other institutions in Texas A&M, then the Experiment Station and Agricultural Extension. That was the system. We didn't have, we had a board of regents, but the legislature had no, I mean, the president and the chancellor took their stuff to the board of regents. The regents said, "Bless you, my son," and we were off and running. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question. It was a different organization, I think.
At Illinois, they kind of launched their PhD program about 10 years ago. Well, they had their first couple students 10 years ago. But I think that something to do with either the university or the state university system approving or not approving things?
Well, getting approval for the PhD program is a process in itself, and that'll probably take you 3 years at least to get it through. You know, to get final. Bless you, my son, you now have a PhD program. I mean, but that's an administrative sort of walkthrough, and it depends upon the mood, the climate. I mean, you got to kind of. I think in our case, when we started with a professional program, the DED, and then about 7 or 8 years later went for the PhD, and that we had to go back through that process again. And what we did, I can remember, we developed the program, developed the strategy, and then sat on it for about 2 years because the mood just wasn't right. I mean, we could see that the way things were going, there wasn't a chance in hell of getting it through. But then after that, the mood changed, the time was right, we had it done, and we went forward with it.
But you had a doctoral type degree before that?
They call it a professional degree, Carla. It's a Doctor of Environmental Design. It's not a lot different than a PhD, but it's just a different name. You do a record of study thing, which is just like a dissertation, but they don't call it a dissertation.
Harvard has one of those, and they call it Doctor of Design Studies.
Yeah.
Otherwise known as Dr. Des, as distinct from the MDes.
It's what they call it. It's like a Doctor of Engineering degree is considered a professional degree. It's not a PhD.
Perhaps just to add a little bit of information on a couple of items. And going back to the case of A&M, I know, for instance, in the case of A&M, there are precedents of faculty members that don't have a PhD, but are entitled to chair PhD committees. So there are precedents around the country that actually allow us for build-up of capacity, if that's the objective. Now, on the subject of PhD programs, one of our challenges here, obviously, is that we don't have differential tuition.
Oh dear.
And in many institutions, that is actually pretty attractive for the institution to develop a PhD. I remember at A&M, when I was there, an undergraduate, the multiplier on the formula funding for an undergraduate was 1, master's was 4, PhD was 9.
Yeah.
So basically, for the university was financially viable to develop PhD programs because the formula funding supported very well. Here, unfortunately, we don't have.
You don't have that difference in subvention.
Makes that difficult.
Yeah.
I do have a question that it's perhaps goes more to the fundamentals, and you mentioned that we need to stop saying that we're different. Now, my question is that because we are not different, or because we cannot sell that we are different?
I think it's both, Guillermo. First of all, I don't think we are different. We're academic practitioners, or at least we better be, because that's our environment, that's our job. I think as a series of professions, whether it's planning, landscape architecture, or architecture, we have a great deal to do with the built environment, which God knows is desperately in need of good documented research, particularly when you look at the environmental fit of things. And who better, to be working in this area? So, no, it's not a traditional form of practice, but we should be doing that. We should be. If you don't, you're going to end up right where they ended up in Great Britain, 5 years ago, or whether when they finally decided architecture was an art. It wasn't a profession; it was an art, and they essentially, defrocked or whatever you do to something like that. Architects, to artists. In this, whatever they call surveyors or whatever, were considered the. I don't know all about that, but I just remember the brouhaha over that several years back. So the same thing could happen to us if we don't get our butts in gear and start really. This issue of claiming knowledge, of saying that knowledge is part of our base, I think is real. You know, you say you can't own knowledge, oh, poo-poo. You damn well better believe engineers will tell you they own knowledge. So anyway, does that answer the question? Or Chris?
Harlow, General brought up a point that I didn't know much about, and that's the differential tuition. That aside, if that wasn't an issue, would we be best to start this process by just designing a PhD program or by hiring PhDs to help us service?
All above are true.
If we had to make a first step, which would you?
I'd sit down and start designing a PhD program today. Start on that plan that I outlined. I realized that what I was talking about, I wasn't giving many, but that's essentially how I built the research program in thinking back on it. And I think it's the way you build a PhD program or a research program. You've got to sit down and plan. You've got to figure out, you know, who your competition is, who your clientele are. You know, what do you want to be as a faculty? Don't be getting in a damn room fighting about this, that, and the other thing. Get in there and try to celebrate your likenesses rather than your differences. Okay? And build a program. If you got that program in your back pocket, this man right here, the dean or the next dean, whoever he come, now's the time to talk PhD. Yes, sir, I got it right here. We're ready to go. Okay? If you got to sit around and think about it for 2 years, you're way behind.
About how many doctoral students graduated in each year?
3 to 5. You don't graduate a whole lot of them.
And then did the master's program feed the PhD program, or did you have kind of an escalator where people just went from undergrad right into the PhD program?
Nope. Most of our PhDs came as PhD candidates. It's sort of a whole different mindset. Our master's programs are just like the master's program here. It's a first professional degree, let's face it. I mean, it's essentially a compacted undergraduate degree into 3 years. I mean, let's be honest. It's a first professional degree. It is not a research degree. Does that make, I don't know if I...
We're not reading the microphone back here in the back row, but I promise I'll walk it up if anybody has any questions after this. I'm curious about your idea of hiring someone at half salary and asking them to generate the other half of salary with grant funding. Did that happen at A&M in the landscape architecture department?
No, it happens in engineering, though, a lot.
Okay.
And I think it's a very viable model. I mean, we didn't have, for example, we didn't have contract positions, but apparently the department has 4. Well, you take those contract positions and turn 2 of them into 50% research right off. Give them 2 years, you know, the first year and the second year to develop the research thing, but in the third year, 50% of that salary goes away. And I think you can find that there will people be interested in doing that. Okay? It can be a very viable model. And just like I said, stop and think. If you got 4 on 50%, that's 2 more FTEs. So I mean, in terms of the resources, to me, it's a very viable way that y'all can look at starting to build, you know, a research cadre in this. And 2 of the guys that I work with are good colleagues, both of them over at, heaven forbid, the other institution, UT. They were full-time researchers. They were engineers. They showed on the faculty. They advised PhD students, but they didn't teach. You know, I think maybe Mike maybe taught 1 class he maybe taught a seminar once every couple of years or so if he felt like it. But most of the time it was just, you know, he was strictly a research faculty, and he was a very good PhD advisor, and he was a darn good researcher. And I had a glorious time working with him. I mean, I've consulted with him, and you know, we've done a lot of fun stuff together. And that's the kind of collegial kinds of things that once you get into this research thing, you'll find yourself developing if you look. I mean, if your thing is in physical geography or something, go find yourself a physical geography and, you know, and get into that kind of stuff and you know, feed on each other and have some fun with it. I'd love to have found a historical geologist to work with early on, because that land base was something that was very interesting to me. It kind of complemented my interest in agronomy, dirt, that kind of stuff. But again, it wasn't what I started out to do, and it certainly wasn't what I thought. I mean, I'm having a blast here this year in a lot of ways, because I'm finally just focused entirely on the students. Don't have to worry about doing any research, or bills due, or reports due, or somebody's having trouble, or something broke at the lab, or whatever. I'm strictly able to teach. That's great, but it's a privilege that that academics or young academicians in emerging programs, you don't have that luxury, I don't think. You're going to have to research and publish.
I'd like to ask a question. If I'm understanding you right, you're saying that research is the act of academic practice. And I wanted to ask you whether practice is the act of academic practice, traditional practice. I know that you were doing practice while you were doing academic research.
Yeah, but no, I really was never practicing. I mean, we did some design work, but basically it was working with cities in the context-sensitive design sort of context, helping them understand their communities and develop guidelines and stuff for the for the development of, primarily our focus was on streets, imagine that. But basically that's what if there was a practical or practice part to it, that's the kind of thing we were doing. But the last time I probably did a major project was probably '85.
So is there ever a circumstance in developing our program where practice could be seen as academic practice, where traditional LA practice, the practitioner as an academic scholar works?
I think it's important as a part of the tenure process for young PhD students that don't have a practice background. I think that those 5 years en route to tenure need to be spent in the field getting contact with practice. They need to go work in the summers. They don't need to be hanging out here necessarily. They can do both, okay, but that should be part of their responsibility. I think the danger to the profession is when we lose the broader sight of what landscape architecture is really all about. And if you get caught up in this business of reduction, getting constantly knowing more and more about less and less, that's going to be out of our province. What we have to realize is we're compartmentalized. I'm working on stormwater quality and stormwater stuff, which is a major issue to everybody out there practicing in site design, because they have to put it in the plans because it's required by law. The fact that I'm an expert in that just means that I can publish and tell them what they should be doing, or help them understand what they should be doing with a degree of confidence. And I think that's a very important mission. We need more of that. And of course, I tend to be I'm an empiricist. I have to admit it. If I can't see it, I don't believe it. I want to count it and feel it and touch it and put a number on it. I can't deal with the softer social science side. I'm just not there. To me, a correlation is in the 90s. It ain't a .125. Sorry. Whatever. Does that answer the question? I don't think. The big problem, Jody, with trying to put practice in as a part of academic practice takes the focus off what we should be doing, A, and B, I don't think we need to be competing with the profession necessarily. We need to be feeding that profession. And, there are certain things in public service projects that I think are good for the students. Those can be justified. That's a form of practice. But it's not practice as in entering design competitions and doing this, that, and the other thing. The only profession I know that really does that and gets away with it is art. And I think we've discussed that before. I mean, art, basically, that's their main key in the academic world, is their exhibits and things like that. But if you're in academic practice, you need to be developing your research agenda and contributing to the profession through the publication and dissemination of information that we generate. And when we start doing that, we'll stop these damn legislators in the engineering profession telling us what the hell we can do and what we can't do, you know, by restrictive practice laws, which just drive me up the wall. Anyway.
We're entering that right now. Are there any other questions then? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I guess as a student, I have a question about this, these programs in general. I was wondering how prevalent these PhD programs are across the country and what are their focuses in general. As a design student, I guess I always assumed that I would get a PhD.
Hon, I'm sorry, it wasn't clear, and I really didn't understand exactly what you said.
I guess my first question was, how prevalent are these programs across the country? Like, how many of them are there?
How many are programs, PhD programs? You know, I hesitate to say. I know there's places that are working on them, but I mean the old-timey ones are the MIT, Harvard one, Berkeley, A&M. K-State was working on one. There are several planning PhD programs around the country. Chapel Hill's had one for years and years. Oregon's gotten one. I think they're working on a PhD at Washington now. But I really don't know how many there are. A great majority of them, unfortunately, in my way of thinking, focus on the social science side, which tends to be a soft science. I think we need much more work done in the materials science area, in the process area, and in some of these areas where it's a fundamental support of getting something built. Okay, and you know, how well people enjoy it and so forth and so on. That's a wonderful thing. And I think we can learn from that. I don't mean to put it down, but it's not, in my estimation, fundamental empirical research.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we'll give him a thank you. There are cookies and things outside. Please have some.